Lady Kira stood at the highest window of her family tower and watched the 3 moons rise over the crystal spires of the elven capital city, and her heart felt heavy with a weight she could not name, because today marked the 15th year of her search, and she was no closer to finding what she sought than when she had started. And the other noble families whispered behind their hands, calling her obsessed and foolish and wasteful. The door opened behind her, and she did not need to turn to know it was Shimmer, her oldest and most loyal dragon companion. And the great silver beast moved with surprising quiet for something so large and pressed her warm scaled head against Kira's shoulder in a gesture of comfort that needed no words, and Kira reached up to stroke the dragon's snout, feeling some of her sadness ease because at least she had her dragons, even when everyone else thought she had lost her mind. Her brother Lord Taven had visited that morning with the family advisors, and their faces had been grave with concern and disappointment, and Taven had spoken in that careful voice he used when trying to be patient, and he said, "Sister, you must stop this madness, and you have spent half our family fortune chasing shadows, and myths in the other houses laugh at us now, and call us the family of fools." And Kira had wanted to scream at him that he did not understand that this was important, that the humans were real. But she had learned long ago that no one believed her. The elven people had ruled the known galaxy for 10,000 years with their magic and their long lives, and their perfect cities built from living crystal and singing metal. And they thought themselves the peak of civilization, the chosen children of the stars, and most elves could not imagine that any other race could be their equal, let alone surpass them in any way. And so when Kira spoke of humans of a race with no magic who had somehow survived in the harshest reaches of space, they smiled and nodded and treated her like a child telling fantasy stories. But Kira had seen the old records hidden deep in the forbidden archives where few elves bothered to look, and she had found accounts from 3,000 years ago, when elven scout ships had encountered human vessels in the outer territories, and the reports had been strange and contradictory. And some scouts described humans as primitive and weak, while others wrote with barely concealed fear about their adaptability and their refusal to give up no matter how impossible the situation. And then suddenly all contact stopped, and the humans vanished from every known system, and the Elven Council had declared them extinct and forbidden further investigation. That declaration had been issued 2,900 years ago, and most elves had forgotten humans had ever existed at all. But Kira could not forget, and she did not know why this mystery consumed her. But it did, and she had dedicated her life to finding the truth. And now, 15 years later, she had traveled to over 200 worlds and spent mountains of gold on information brokers and ancient star charts and interviews with the oldest elves who might remember something, and she had found nothing but dead ends and false leads. Storm and Ash, her other 2 dragons, landed on the wide balcony outside the window, and they folded their wings and peered in at her with concerned eyes. And dragons were not like other animals because they were intelligent, in ways that most people did not understand, and they bonded with their chosen riders for life, and these 3 had chosen Kira when she was barely more than a child, and they had stayed with her through everything, and she loved them more than she could ever express in words. She turned away from the window and walked to her desk where maps and data tablets covered every surface, and she had marked every place she had searched with red symbols, and the map looked like it had a disease with red marks spreading across known space. And she picked up the latest report from a broker on the frontier station of Kelvar's Point, and the message claimed someone had seen ancient human artifacts in a ruined station near the void between Spiral, Arms, and it was probably another lie. Another person trying to take her money, but she had to check because what if this time it was real? Her family would not give her more funding, and Taven had made that clear this morning. And he said, the family. Accounts were nearly empty, and their influence in the noble courts had dropped to almost nothing, and he begged her to stop, to come home to marry someone from a powerful house and restore their name. And Kira had felt her chest tighten with panic, because if she stopped searching now, then 15 years would be wasted and she would never know the truth. And that thought was worse than poverty or shame. So she had made a decision, and she would sell her personal possessions and take her ship and her dragons and go to this one last lead. And if it proved false, then she would have to accept that maybe everyone was right, and maybe humans really were just a myth, and maybe she had wasted her life chasing nothing. But she had to know, and She could not live with herself if she gave up without checking every possible option. She called her dragons to her, and they came immediately gathering around her in the large chamber, and Shimmer lowered her head so Kira could press her forehead against the dragon's scales, and she whispered, "I know you are tired of traveling, and I know this seems foolish, but please trust me one more time." And Shimmer rumbled deep in her chest, which meant yes, and Storm and Ash added their own sounds of agreement because dragons did not abandon their riders no matter how crazy the quest. The next morning, Kira loaded her small personal ship with supplies and the last of her credits, and she filed a flight plan to Kelvar's Point, which was 3 weeks of travel through hyperspace lanes, and her family did not come to see her off except for one servant who had known her since childhood. And the old woman pressed a small package into Kira's hands and said, "May the stars guide you home, lady," and Kira had to blink back tears because she did not know if she would have a home to return to. The journey was long and lonely, and the hyperspace lanes between civilized systems grew more dangerous the farther out she traveled, and twice she had to change course to avoid pirate territories, and once Storm chased off a small ship that tried to follow them, and Kira spent the quiet hours reading and rereading the old accounts of human encounters and trying to understand what had happened to an entire Species 1 account stuck in her mind, and it was from an elven diplomat named Seriath who had spent 6 months on a human trading station, and she wrote that humans were strange and contradictory, and they had no magic but built wonders. Anyway, and they lived such short lives, barely 100 years yet. They dreamed of futures they would never see, and they argued constantly among themselves, but came together when threatened. And Seriath had written, "I do not understand them, but I think perhaps they understand something we have forgotten." And Kira wondered what that something was. Finally, after 3 weeks, her ship dropped out of hyperspace near Kelvar's Point, and the station was a rough, ugly thing built from salvaged metal and desperation, and it served the miners and traders and mercenaries who worked in the lawless frontier. And Kira docked carefully and told her dragons to stay with the ship, because this was not a safe place for anyone, let alone creatures as valuable as them. She entered the station through the main airlock, and immediately the smell hit her, and it was sweat, and oil, and cheap food, and unwashed bodies. And the corridors were narrow and dark, and people watched her pass with calculating eyes because an elven noble was rare in a place like this, and she kept one hand on the small plasma pistol hidden in her coat, and walked with confidence she did not feel. The information broker worked out of a storage room near the bottom levels of Kelvar's Point station, and Kira had to descend through increasingly rough sections where the lights flickered and the air tasted metallic, and people looked at her with open hostility because elven nobles did not belong in places like this, and she clutched her coat tighter and tried to look more dangerous than she felt. The broker was a Zelthian, which meant he had 4 arms and gray skin covered in scales, and he looked her up and down with his triple-pupiled eyes and said, "So you are the crazy elf who chases ghosts." And Kira felt her face heat with shame, because apparently her reputation had spread even to the frontier stations, and she lifted her chin and said, "I pay well for good information." And the broker laughed and said, "Not anymore, I heard. And your family cut you off." She placed her last credit chip on his desk, and it contained everything she had left after selling her jewelry, and her fine clothes and her collection of rare books, and the broker picked it up and scanned it and whistled and said, "This will barely cover my fee, lady. And what makes you think I have anything worth this much?" And Kira felt desperation claw at her throat, because if this lead was false, then she truly had nothing left. But she forced her voice to stay steady and said, "You sent me a message about human artifacts in a ruined station." And the broker nodded slowly and said, "I did, and I have coordinates. But I warn you, the place is dangerous, and most people who go there do not come back. And there are stories about that sector and ships that vanish." And Kira said, "I do not care about stories, and I need those coordinates." The broker studied her for a long moment, and something like pity crossed his face, and he said, "You really believe, do you not, and you think you will find them alive out there?" And Kira said, "I have to try." And the broker sighed and transferred the data to her tablet and said, "May your gods protect you, elf, because you will need it." And Kira took the tablet and left before he could see the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She made her way back to her ship through the crowded corridors and past the main trading area where merchants sold everything from weapons to food to information, and normally she would have hurried through, but something made her stop and look at one particular stall, because the items displayed there were strange, unlike anything she had seen before. The merchant was a man of average height with brown skin and dark hair, and he wore clothes that did not match any known culture, and his accent was odd when he called out to passers-by, trying to interest them in his wares, and most people ignored him or laughed at his goods because they looked primitive and handmade, without the polish of modern manufacturing. Kira found herself walking closer, drawn by curiosity, and she looked at the tools on display. And they were simple things, hammers and knives and small machines whose purpose she could not guess, and the craftsmanship was decent, but nothing special. And she picked up a knife and turned it over in her hands, and the balance was good. But the design was strange, with a grip that did not quite fit elven hands. The merchant noticed her interest and said, "That is a good blade, lady, and it will last you a lifetime, and the metal is folded 500 times for strength," and Kira almost dropped it, because 500 times was absurd and no one folded metal that many times anymore, and she said, "Where did you get this?" And the merchant smiled and said, "I made it myself, and all these things are my own work." She looked at him more closely, and he seemed nervous around her, as if unused to attention from someone of her status, and she felt a flash of irritation, because this was clearly some backward craftsman trying to sell junk to foolish tourists, and she had wasted enough time already, and she dropped the knife back on the table and said, "Your work is primitive and inefficient, and you should find a better trade." The merchant's smile faded and hurt flashed across his face, but he said nothing and just started to pack up his wares, and Kira felt a mean satisfaction at putting him in his place because she was tired and frustrated and scared about the mission ahead, and taking it out on some random merchant made her feel slightly better, even though she knew it was wrong. She turned to leave, but the merchant called after her and said, "Wait," and she looked back, and he held out a small carved figure of a dragon and said, "Take this, and no charge, and maybe it will bring you luck on whatever quest drives an elven lady to places like this." And Kira wanted to refuse, but something about the carving caught her eye because it was beautiful, with every scale detailed perfectly, and whoever made it understood dragons in a way most artists did not. She took it without thanking him and walked away and did not look back, even though she felt his sad gaze following her, and later when she reached her ship she almost threw the carving away, but instead she tucked it into her pocket and told herself she would look at it later, and then she forgot about it because she had coordinates to follow and a mystery to solve. Her ship left Kelvar's Point 3 hours later, and the coordinates led her toward a region marked as hazardous on most star charts, and even the pirate clans avoided this area because ships disappeared here without explanation, and Kira told herself it was just solar storms or gravitational anomalies. But her hands shook as she programmed the navigation computer storm, and Ash sensed her fear and pressed close on either side of her pilot chair while Shimmer coiled in the back of the cockpit, humming low sounds meant to soothe, and Kira was grateful for them because she did not know what she would do without her dragons, and they were the only constants in her life when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The journey took 5 days through increasingly empty space, and the stars grew sparse, and the darkness between them seemed to press against the ship's windows like something alive and hungry, and Kira checked her sensors constantly but found nothing except the coordinates growing closer with each passing hour. Finally, they arrived at the location, and Kira's breath caught because there was a station here, old and damaged but definitely artificial, and it hung in space like a broken skeleton. And the design was unlike anything in current elven records, and she felt her heart race because this could be it. This could be real evidence of human civilization. She approached, slowly scanning for danger, and her sensors picked up no life signs and no power readings, and the station seemed completely dead. But as she drew closer, she saw markings on the hull and symbols that matched descriptions from the old texts, and she knew with certainty that humans had built this place. Her hands trembled as she suited up and prepared to board the station, and Storm volunteered to come with her, because dragons could survive in space for short periods using magic to create air bubbles around their heads. And Kira was grateful for the company, because the station looked haunted and she did not want to face it alone. They crossed from the ship to the station through a damaged airlock, and Kira's suit lights cut through the darkness, revealing corridors filled with floating debris and frozen air, and everything was coated in ice that sparkled in her light beam. And she moved carefully, testing each surface before putting her weight on it. The station was massive, larger than she had expected, and room after room revealed remnants of the people who had lived here, and she found personal quarters with pictures still hanging on walls, showing humans smiling and laughing and living their lives. And she found a cafeteria with tables bolted to the floor and a kitchen that had probably once smelled of cooking food and warmth, and she found herself crying inside her helmet because these people had been real. They had existed. They had lived and loved and built this place, and then something had happened, and they were gone. In what looked like a command center, she found computer terminals and she tried to access them, but the power was long dead and the data was corrupted beyond recovery. And she felt frustration build because she was so close to answers but could not reach them, and Storm rumbled sympathetically and nudged her shoulder with his great head. They spent hours searching the station and found more evidence of human habitation, but no clue about what had happened or where the people had gone, and finally, exhausted and disappointed, Kira admitted defeat and returned to her ship, and she sat in her pilot chair staring at the dead station through her window and wondered if she would ever know the truth. Kira returned to Elven space 3 weeks later with nothing to show for her journey, except pictures of an abandoned station and a heart full of questions that would never be answered, and she docked at a public station instead of going home because she could not face her family and admit total failure. And besides, she had no home anymore because Taven had sent her a message saying the family tower was being sold to pay their debts. She sat in a cheap rented room with her 3 dragons crammed into a space too small for them and counted the few credits she had left, and it was enough for maybe 2 weeks of food and fuel, and then she would have nothing. And she had never been poor before, and the reality of it scared her more than she wanted to admit. And Shimmer pressed close and radiated warmth and comfort. But even that could not chase away the cold fear in her stomach. The carved dragon figure the merchant had given her sat on the small table, and she picked it up and turned it over in her hands, and the craftsmanship really was remarkable. And she wondered why someone with such skill was selling goods in a frontier station instead of working for a noble house. And then she felt guilty for how she had treated him, and he had been kind offering her a gift, and she had been cruel because she was angry at the universe and he was simply there. She made a decision, and she would sell everything she still owned, including her ship, and that would give her enough money to survive for maybe 6 months, and in that time she would find work somehow and rebuild her life, and she would have to give up the search for humans and accept that some mysteries would never be solved, and the thought made her want to scream, but she had no choice. The next morning she went to a shipbroker and negotiated a price, and it was far less than the ship was worth, but she was desperate and the broker knew it, and she signed the documents with hands that shook and walked away, with a credit chip that represented the end of everything she had worked for. And Storm and Ash and Shimmer followed her in silence, and she could feel their sadness mixing with her own. That evening she sat in a bar drinking elven wine that cost too much and trying to decide what to do next, and a woman approached her table, and the woman was old even by elven standards, with silver hair and eyes that had seen centuries pass, and she said, "I know who you are, and you are Lord Kira who searched for the lost humans." And Kira flinched and said, "I am no lord anymore, and my search is over." The woman sat without invitation and studied Kira with uncomfortable intensity and said, "I knew your great-grandmother, and she told me once that our people had grown soft and forgotten what it meant to struggle. And she said we needed to remember that strength comes not from magic or long life, but from the will to keep going when everything seems lost." And Kira said, "That is a nice story, but it does not help me now." The woman reached into her coat and pulled out a data chip and placed it on the table between them and said, "This is the last gift I can give you, and it contains coordinates to a system that does not appear on any official charts. And an old friend told me before she died that humans might still exist there, hidden away from the galaxy, and I was saving this information for someone worthy. And I think that someone is—" Yukira stared at the chip and felt something twist in her chest, and she said, "I have no money left and I cannot pay you. And besides, why would you give this to someone who has failed at everything?" And the woman smiled and said, "Because you tried when no one else would, and because your great-grandmother would want me to, and because maybe you have not failed yet." She picked up the chip with trembling fingers and said, "Why do you believe in them?" And the woman's expression grew distant and said, "Because 300 years ago, I met one, and he saved My life when I was injured on a frontier world and he had no reason to help an elf and we were nothing to each other. But he stopped anyway and tended my wounds and stayed with me until rescue came. And when I asked why, he just smiled and said, because it was the right thing to do. And then he left and I never saw him again. Kira felt tears on her cheeks and she did not remember starting to cry. And she said, what was his name? And the woman said, I never learned it. And he would not tell me. And I think perhaps his people were hiding even then. And he took a risk helping me. And I have always wondered if they survived, if they found somewhere safe. And the woman stood and placed a hand on Kira's shoulder and said, find out for me, lady, and tell them that one elf remembered their kindness. The next morning, Kira used almost all her remaining credits to book passage on a cargo ship heading toward the Outer Rim. And the captain was a gruff man who asked no questions when she paid extra to bring 3 dragons aboard. And the journey took 2 months with stops at 5 different stations to transfer cargo and pick up passengers, and Kira spent the time in the small cabin she shared with her dragons and studied the coordinates and tried not to think about what she would do if this lead proved false like all the others. The cargo ship dropped her at a rough mining colony called Haven's End, and the captain said this was as far as he went and the coordinates were another. 3 weeks' travel beyond the mapped lanes, and Kira thanked him and disembarked with her dragons and stood on the landing pad wondering how she would continue, because she had no ship and no money to hire one. But Storm had an idea, and he was the largest of her 3 dragons and strong enough to carry her through space if she wore her environment suit and could survive the cold and the radiation for short jumps. And it was dangerous and probably insane, but Kira had come too far to stop. Now when she suited up and climbed onto Storm's back and Ash and Shimmer flew on either side as they launched into the black, they traveled in short jumps with long rests on dead moons and asteroids where Kira would set up a small shelter and the dragons would hunt space creatures that drifted in the void. And it was the hardest thing she had ever done, and more than once she wanted to give up and return to Haven's End and admit defeat. But each time Storm would rumble encouragement and Shimmer would press close and Ash would bring her strange frozen creatures to eat. And somehow she kept going. After 3 weeks of this brutal travel, the coordinates finally appeared on her suit's navigation system, and she saw a star ahead, dim and unremarkable and orbiting. It were several planets, and one of them, according to the data, was capable of supporting life. And Kira felt her heart race, because this was it. This was the moment, and either humans existed or they did not. And she would finally know the truth. They approached the planet carefully, and Kira scanned for any signs of technology or civilization, and at first she found nothing, and disappointment began to crush her chest. But then, Storm dove lower through the atmosphere, and suddenly there were structures below cities and farms and roads all laid out in patterns that matched the old descriptions from 3,000 years ago. And Kira could not breathe, could not think, could only stare, because they were real humans, were real. And she had found them. Storm landed in a clearing near a small town, and Kira climbed off his back on shaking legs and removed her helmet, because the air was breathable and sweet, and she saw people emerging from buildings, and they were human shorter than elves with rounded ears and varied features, and they stared at her and her dragons with shock and wonder. An older woman approached, and she moved with authority and confidence and spoke in a language Kira did not know, but her suit's translator kicked in after a moment, and the woman said, "Welcome, stranger." And we do not get many visitors, and Kira tried to respond, but words would not come, and she just stood there crying and shaking because 15 years of searching had led to this moment, and she had found them. She had actually found them. Then a man pushed through the crowd, and Kira's breath caught because she knew that face, and it was older now with gray in the hair and lines around the eyes. But it was definitely him, and it was the merchant from Kelver's Point, the one she had mocked and called primitive. And he looked at her with recognition and said, "So you found us, after all, Lady Elf." Kira felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, and Shimmer caught her before she fell and kept her upright with gentle pressure. And the shame that crashed over her was so intense, she could barely breathe, because this man, this human she had treated with such cruelty, was standing in front of her on his own world, surrounded by his own people, and she was the outsider. The fool who had wasted a fortune searching for something that had been right in front of her 5 years ago. The man whose name she still did not know stepped closer, and his expression was complicated, mixing recognition with something that might have been sadness or pity. And he said, You spent all that money looking for us, did you not? And I tried to tell you that day, and I tried to explain, but you were so angry and you would not listen. And Kira wanted to sink into the earth and disappear because he was right, and she had been too arrogant, too consumed by her own frustration to see what was obvious. She forced herself to meet his eyes, and her voice came out broken and small, and she said, I am sorry, and I was cruel to you, and I did not know, and I did not understand. And the words felt pathetic and inadequate, but they were all she had. And the man studied her for a long moment, and then his expression softened, and he said, I know. And I saw it in your eyes that day, and you were desperate and scared. And sometimes people lash out when they hurt. The older woman who had first approached them spoke again, and she introduced herself as Mayor Linda, and said, perhaps we should take this conversation somewhere more comfortable. And also, your dragons are magnificent, but they are frightening the children. And could we maybe sit down and talk like civilized people? And Kira felt a hysterical laugh bubble up, because civilized was not something she felt right now, but she nodded and followed them into the town. The buildings were simple but sturdy, made from local materials, and designed with practical efficiency, rather than elven aesthetics, and people watched from windows and doorways as they passed, and some looked curious, while others seemed wary, and Kira did not blame them because an elf with 3 dragons appearing without warning must have been terrifying. They entered a large community building that seemed to serve as both meeting hall and dining area, and Mayor Linda gestured for Kira to sit at a long wooden table, and someone brought water and simple food, and Kira realized she had not eaten properly in days, and her hands shook as she drank, and the man who she had mocked sat across from her and said, my name is Danny Cooper, and I think we should start this conversation properly. Kira set down her cup and said, I am Kira, and I was Lady Kira of House Silverthorn, but I have no title anymore, and no house and no fortune because I spent everything searching for your people. And Danny nodded slowly and said, I heard stories about an elf asking questions in the frontier stations, and I knew eventually someone would find us, and I hoped it would be someone kind, but here you are. The words stung, but Kira deserved them, and she said, why were you there? And why were you selling things in a place like Kelver's Point if you knew I was looking? And Danny smiled sadly and said, because we need to make contact carefully, and we send people out to the frontier to observe and to trade, and to see if the galaxy has changed since our ancestors went into hiding. And I volunteered because I am good with my hands, and I thought selling crafts would let me meet different species and learn about them, he continued, and said, when I saw you that day, I knew immediately you were the elf everyone talked about and the one obsessed with finding humans, and I thought maybe this is our chance, and maybe I can make contact and start building a bridge between our peoples. And so I tried to show you my work, and I tried to start a conversation, but you were having a bad day, and I was just someone to take your anger out on, and I understood, but it still hurt. Mayor Linda spoke then, and she said, Danny came home and told us he had met you, and he said, you would find us eventually because you had the look of someone who never gives up, and he was right, and now here you are, exhausted and broke and riding dragons through space like some kind of legend, and I have to say that is impressive, even if you were rude to our boy. Kira felt tears sliding down her face again, and she said, I do not deserve your kindness, and I do not deserve to be here, and I wasted 15 years and a fortune and hurt people along the way, and for what? And Danny reached across the table and placed his hand over hers and said, you found us, and that matters, and you did not give up even when everyone told you to, and that takes courage. She looked up at him and said, why did you give me that carved dragon, and why were you kind when I was cruel? And Danny smiled and said, because that is what humans do, and we have learned through our history that holding grudges and seeking revenge only makes things worse, and we would rather forgive and move forward. And besides, the look in your eyes that day told me you needed kindness even if you did not know it. Mayor Linda stood and said, I think we need to explain some things, and you deserve to know why we disappeared and why we have been hiding for 3,000 years. And Kira nodded and tried to focus, even though exhaustion was pulling at her, and Mayor Linda began to speak, and her voice was steady and clear. She said 3,000 years ago, humans had spread across many systems, and we traded with the elves and other species, and mostly things were peaceful. But then there was a war, and not with your people, but with a race called the Devourers who consumed worlds and left nothing behind, and they were unstoppable. And species after species fell before them, and the galaxy was terrified. Mayor Linda continued and said the elves tried to fight them with magic and it failed. And the Zelthians tried with technology and they failed, and the Korthans tried with military might and they failed. And everyone was dying and planets were burning, and it looked like the Devourers would consume everything, and then humanity made a decision. And we decided to do the one thing we were good at, which was surviving in impossible places. She said we took our colony ships, and we went to the edge of the galaxy to places no one else wanted, in systems that were hidden and hard to reach, and we erased ourselves from the star charts, and we stopped all communication, and we became ghosts. And the Devourers could not find what did not exist. And we survived by hiding while the galaxy burned. Danny picked up the story and said eventually the Devourers moved on, and no one knows why, and maybe they ran out of resources, or maybe they found something else to consume. But they left, and the galaxy began to rebuild, and humanity could have revealed ourselves then, but we made another choice, and we decided to stay hidden because we had learned something important about the galaxy. And we learned that when things are good, everyone wants to be friends. But when things are bad, people look for someone to blame, he said. And we knew that if we came back, the other species would ask why we ran and why we did not fight and why we survived when so many died. And they would blame us for not helping, even though helping would have meant dying too. And so, we stayed hidden. And we built our worlds, and we lived quietly. And we sent out scouts like me to watch and to learn and to wait for a time when maybe the galaxy would be ready to meet us again. Kira listened to all of this and felt her understanding of history crumble, because the Elven record said nothing about the Devourers and nothing about humanity's sacrifice. And she said, why does no one remember this? And Mayor Linda said, because the survivors wanted to forget, and they rewrote history and pretended the Devourers never existed, and convinced themselves that all those dead worlds were just natural disasters, and it was easier than living with the trauma, Danny said. And that is why when you were searching for us, everyone thought you were crazy, and they did not remember we existed, and they certainly did not remember owing us any debt. And Kira felt anger rise hot and fierce because her people had forgotten, and they had let humanity suffer alone. And then they mocked her for trying to find the truth. But Mayor Linda held up a hand and said, do not be angry at them. And they survived the only way they could. And grief makes people do strange things, and besides, holding on to anger helps no one. And Danny added, and that is why we are not angry at you, and you did not know. And you were just searching for truth, and that is admirable even when the search makes you mean sometimes. Kira stayed in the human settlement for 3 days, and each day brought new revelations about a people she had spent 15 years searching for, and each day made her understand how little she had actually known, despite all her research and all her dedication, and the humans welcomed her with a warmth that made her chest ache, because she did not deserve it, but they gave it anyway. The children were especially fascinated by her dragons, and Storm and Ash and Shimmer basked in the attention, allowing small hands to touch their scales and asking questions through gestures and simple words, because the children did not speak Elven, and Kira did not speak human, but somehow they communicated anyway, and Danny's daughter, who was maybe 8 years old, appointed herself as the official dragon keeper, and brought them food and water and wove flowers into Ash's mane, until the great dragon looked ridiculous and pleased. Danny showed her around the settlement and explained how they lived, and they had no magic, but they had learned to work with the land instead of shaping it to their will, and their buildings were designed to catch rain and channel wind and use solar power, and everything was efficient and practical and beautiful in its simplicity. And Kira found herself thinking that maybe the elves had forgotten how to build things that lasted, because they relied too much on magic to maintain everything. On the second evening, Mayor Linda invited Kira to a community gathering, and the whole town came together to share food and music and stories, and Kira sat with her dragons and watched these people laugh and argue and tease each other, and she realized this was what she had been missing in Elven society, in this sense of community and connection, without the rigid hierarchies and formal protocols that governed every interaction back home. A young woman approached her and introduced herself as Kate, and said, I heard you rode dragons through space to get here, and that is the most amazing thing I have ever heard. And Kira felt embarrassed and said I had no choice, and I had no ship and no money. And Kate laughed and said, exactly, and you did it anyway. And that is what makes it amazing, and most people would have given up. But you found another way. Kate sat beside her and said, Danny told us how you treated him at Kelver's Point, and some people here were angry about it, but he said no, and he said you were just hurting and people hurt others, and we should forgive you and give you a chance, and honestly I think he is too nice sometimes, but he was right. Because you came all this way, and that means something. Kira said, I spent 15 years and a fortune searching for you, and I was cruel too, the one person who could have ended my search, and I do not know how to live with that. And Kate considered this and said, then do not live with it and learn from it instead, and use it to be better. And that is what humans do, and we mess up constantly, but we try to fix things and move forward, and maybe you can do that too. The next morning, Danny took her to see their agricultural systems, and they had developed methods for growing food in difficult soil, using techniques passed down through generations. And he explained each process with pride and passion, and Kira listened and asked questions, and tried to understand how a people with no magic had survived 3,000 years in hiding. And the answer seemed to be stubbornness and innovation, and a refusal to give up even when everything seemed impossible. She asked him if he was angry at her and if he truly forgave her for how she had treated him, and Danny stopped walking and turned to face her, and he said, I was hurt, yes. And what you said that day stung, and I went home and told my wife about it, and she wanted to find you and give you a piece of her mind. But I said no, because you were clearly suffering. And I have learned that most cruelty comes from pain, not malice. He continued, and said, I have thought about you often over the years, and I wondered if you would find us and what I would say if you did. And I imagined being cold or distant or making you feel bad. But now that you are here, I just feel sad. Because you wasted so much time and money when I could have told you everything that day if you had just listened. Kira felt tears threaten again, and she said, I am sorry, and I will say it 1,000 times if you need me to. And Danny smiled and said, you do not need to, because I forgive you, and I mean that truly. And now the question is, what do we do next, because you found us and that changes things. They walked back toward the settlement, and Kira said, what do you mean? And Danny said, well, you know we exist now, and you know where we are, and what will you do with that information, and will you tell the Elven Council, and will you bring others here? And Kira stopped walking because she had not thought that far ahead, and she had been so focused on finding humans that she never considered what would happen after. She said, honestly, I do not know, and my family has no influence anymore, and no one would listen to me even if I tried to tell them. And Danny nodded and said that might be for the best, and we are not ready to reveal ourselves to the whole galaxy yet, and we have been watching and waiting for the right time, and maybe that time is soon, but not quite yet. Mayor Linda joined them, and she had been listening, and she said, however we think, you should stay here for a while and rest and recover and learn about us properly, and then when you are ready we can discuss what comes next. And maybe you can be our ambassador to the elves when the time is right. And Kira felt something warm bloom in her chest because they were offering her purpose when she had thought she had lost everything. That evening, Kira sat with Danny and his family around their dinner table, and his wife, whose name was Helen, served food, and their daughter, whose name was Sophie, talked excitedly about everything she had learned about dragons, and it felt strange and wonderful to be part of this simple domestic scene after years of lonely searching and formal elven dinners full of political maneuvering. Helen said to her, so you are the elf who was mean to my husband, and Kira winced and said yes, and I am deeply sorry. And Helen studied her for a moment and then laughed and said, good, and you should be sorry. But Danny says you are trying to do better, and that is enough for me, and besides, anyone who rides dragons through space cannot be all bad. Sophie asked if Kira would stay and teach her about dragons, and maybe she could learn to ride one. And Kira looked at Storm, who rumbled approval, and she said, I think Storm would like that, and he needs someone to boss him around because he has gotten lazy. And Storm snorted indignantly, which made Sophie giggle later that night. Kira stood outside under unfamiliar stars, and Shimmer pressed close, and she thought about everything that had happened, and 15 years of searching, and all the mistakes she had made, and all the money she had wasted, and somehow she had ended up here in this place with these people who had every reason to reject her but chose kindness instead. Danny found her there and stood beside her in comfortable silence, and finally he said, you know the carved dragon I gave you? And Kira reached into her pocket and pulled it out because she had carried it all this time. And he said I made that the night before I went to Kelvar's Point, and I did not know why I made a dragon. But something told me it was important, and now I think maybe I knew somehow that you would need it. She turned the carving over in her hands and said I almost threw it away and I almost left it behind a dozen times, but something made me keep it. And Danny said maybe that was hope. And maybe even when you were at your lowest, you hoped things would get better. And Kira thought about that and realized he might be right. She said, what happens now? And Danny said, now you rest and you heal and you let us teach you about humanity, and maybe you teach us more about elves, and when you are ready, we will figure out the next steps together. And Kira said together, and he nodded and said together, because that is how humans do things. And we do not leave people behind if we can help it. The next morning, Kira sent a message to the old woman who had given her the coordinates, and the message said, thank you, and I found them. And they are real and they are wonderful, and you should know that your kindness 300 years ago was not forgotten. And the man who saved you would be proud of his people. She also sent a message to her brother, Taven, and it was brief, and it said, I am alive and I was right, and I will explain everything someday, but for now know that I am happy, and I have found something worth more than any fortune or title. And Taven sent back a simple reply that said, I am glad, sister, and come home when you are ready. But Kira was not ready yet, and maybe she would never be ready to return to elven society, because here among the humans, she felt something she had not felt in years, and she felt like she belonged, and she felt like she had purpose, and she felt like maybe all the searching and suffering had led her exactly where she needed to be. Sophie ran up to her and grabbed her hand and said, come on, and Storm says, he will take me flying, and Kira let herself be pulled along, and she looked back at Danny, who was watching with a smile. And she thought about how she had mocked this man, called his work primitive, treated him with cruelty, and he had responded with grace and forgiveness and patience. That was the human gift she realized, and not technology or magic or military might, but the ability to forgive and start over, and choose kindness even when cruelty would be easier, and choose hope even when despair would be justified. And maybe that was why they had survived 3,000 years in hiding, and maybe that was why they were still here. Still building, still dreaming, still believing in better. Tomorrow's Kira climbed onto Storm's back with Sophie in,